All right, so this week we are doing photosynthesis. Last week you did cellular respiration with Mr. Neary. Now we're doing photosynthesis. So the question is, how is photosynthesis influenced by the change of the environment? Which means we're really not going to talk a lot about photosynthesis specifically, but how it affects the environment. Obviously, we're going to start out by reviewing what photosynthesis is and how it ties into conservation of matter. So you should be familiar with that term. Again, I know that we've talked about it before. So remember that photosynthesis is the process that provides food for all life. When I did the remediation last time, we talked about energy flow and the energy pyramid and how the producers produce all the energy for all organisms above it, and it all starts with photosynthesis. So remember the equation, you may have seen this, the opposite reaction last week when you talked about cellular respiration, how we take glucose, that's sugar, and in presence of oxygen, we go through cellular respiration or aerobic respiration. But in order to produce that glucose and oxygen, plants go through photosynthesis. So they take the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, the water, usually from the soil, up through the roots, sunlight, and then they convert that into into glucose and oxygen. All right, so carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, water from the roots, sunlight from the sun, obviously, and then it yields, right? Turns into glucose and oxygen. And we talk about conservation of matter, where matter cannot be created or destroyed. So what goes into this equation has to come out. So if you do the math, you'll see that there's 6 oxygens on this side. Carbons on this side, 6 carbons on the opposite side, right? So that's conservation matter. We don't lose any carbons. And if you do the math, we have 12 hydrogen atoms, 6 times 2, and then we have 12 over here, and then we have 18 oxygen. So 6 times 2 is 12. So we have 12 oxygens in this molecule, and then we have 6 over here. So that's 18, and you'll find out we have 18 over here. So that's conservation of matter. What goes in has to come out. So where does photosynthesis take place? Well, in the plant cell, there's an organelle called the chloroplast. And within that, that's why it's within that is chlorophyll, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. That's the pigment, but that's why the plants are green, the leaves are green, right? So chloroplast within the plant cell is where photosynthesis takes place. Now, pigments are light absorbing molecules. And if you're a painter, you talk a lot about pigments and different types of shades of pigments. So the white light that comes from the sun contains all colors, right? So, if you see it refracted as a rainbow, you can see all the colors. Well, the light waves that are reflected is the color that we see. So for instance, we see that the leaf is green. That means that chlorophyll is reflecting the green light. All right, it is not absorbing, it's absorbing the blues and the reds, but it's reflecting green. So if you put a plant under green light, it won't be able to photosynthesize because all that light is being reflected. If you put it under blue light or red light, it will be able to photosynthesize because those are the colors that are being absorbed, and that's what drives the process of photosynthesis. So if you look here, we have violet and blue is absorbed by chlorophyll, and the oranges and reds, and then the green is reflected by chlorophyll. All right, so here's just a small little picture of photosynthesis occurring. So we have the sunlight, we have the water being taken up from the roots, we have the carbon dioxide entering the leaf from the atmosphere, and it's actually releasing the oxygen, and that happens at the same place. All right, so glucose. So glucose is how plants store energy. It's a high energy molecule. If you remember, it has a lot of chemical bonds, so it does break down. When those bonds are broken, that's when energy is released. Something like starch is it's how plants store long-term energy. We store it as fat. Plants store it as starch. These sugars, these simple sugars, are going to break down a lot faster than these sugars. All right. So simple sugars will break down faster to release their energy and make them faster energy. Starches are designed for long-term storage and will break down more slowly. And then, you talk about that even in like nutrition, right? We shouldn't eat sugar. It breaks down really fast and we don't use it. It gets stored as fat. Whereas starch, that remains a carbohydrate for a lot longer, and we can use it for longer term energy storage. So as I mentioned in the essential question, we talk about factors that affect the rate of photosynthesis. And we put these individually, but we should know that they all act on each other, right? We can't really, in the real world, we can't really separate temperature and light concentration and water and carbon dioxide. But we will try to do that here. And if you remember way back when we did that experiment, the online experiment, when we separated, we were able to adjust the amount of light brightness and water availability and carbon dioxide. We didn't do so much with temperature, but we did that experiments with those other three. So I think we did this in this notes is what would happen if temperature increased? What would happen to the rate of photosynthesis? What would happen to the rate of photosynthesis if the light concentration increased? What would happen if water availability increased or decreased? What would happen to the rate of photosynthesis? And same with carbon dioxide concentration. So you don't necessarily have to write those down, but go ahead and just think about it for a second. So here is temperature. So temperature is a pretty tricky one, because what happens is that, if you think about being cold, or in the wintertime, plants are dormant, and so they don't go through a lot of, they may still be creating some type of energy, but it's a very low rate, right? So very low rate. But as the temperature increases, well, the rate of photosynthesis will increase. But what happens if it gets too hot? Well, some proteins that help with the rate of photosynthesis or help photosynthesis take place start to break down in the cell. And so when that happens, photosynthesis will drop off quite fast, because we don't have those things that start chemical reactions. They're not there anymore. And so they'll start, these chemical reactions will stop taking place. And it happens to us too, is if we get too hot, for too long a period of time, our chemical reactions will stop breaking down. And so that will, eventually can kill us, right? So it does actually go to zero. It will kill the plant and the chemical reactions will not take place. So light concentration. So this is the amount of light or photons that are coming from the sun and hitting the plant, because those are the particles that enter the plant cell and excite the chlorophyll, right? So that actually gets, and when I say excite, I mean like the energy activates. And so the more particles, the rate of photosynthesis will increase. But that also depends on how many chlorophyll, chloroplasts or chlorophyll is available, right? If there's an increase of photons, then the rate of photosynthesis will increase. However, some factors, again, as I mentioned, that can contribute to the photosynthesis, if there's a lot of sunlight, well, maybe there isn't enough rain, right? So maybe if there's a lot of sunlight, there may not be a lot of water available, right? So that's always the tricky part. And then how big the size of the leaf, right? So the amount of chlorophyll molecules absorbing the light. So you can see here, so this on the left may not get a lot of sunlight because it's a really big leaf. It has a lot of chlorophyll molecules. So this is maybe something you see that might be the underside of a forest, right? Because it's trying to get as much sunlight as it can, because there's maybe not a lot of light hitting it. Where these would be on the top, always exposed to the sun, so the leaves are smaller and they don't need as many chlorophyll molecules because the sun is always hitting them and they're always able to start that process of photosynthesis. So pigging back on that, I guess, would it be, the amount of light? Well, we have the amount of water availability, right? So water is actually the first thing that, the first molecule that is affected by photosynthesis. That excitement of the chlorophyll, what it does is it splits the molecule, the water molecule, into hydrogen and oxygen. All right, so what happens if so water is split in photosynthesis. This also limits the amount of carbon dioxide coming into the plant because there will not be enough energy to form the glucose molecule from CO2. All right, so if there's too much water, then it, I'm trying to find here. Maybe I'm going a little bit too ahead of myself. Water is split in photosynthesis to produce hydrogen and oxygen gas, so oxygen is released. This also limits the amount of carbon dioxide coming into the plant. There will not be enough energy to form the glucose molecule for carbon dioxide. Okay, so if the leaves begin to dry, they close their holes in there. So these fancy holes in the bottom of leaves are called stomata. So if there's not enough water available, what will happen, it will close those in order to conserve water, right? And so if those are closed, then carbon dioxide can't come in. And then I think that's what we were saying before, right? So if there's not enough water, then carbon dioxide can't. So the whole process of photosynthesis will slow down. And then the last is carbon dioxide. So normal carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are really quite low. So we're at 0.4%, maybe a little bit above that. So you can just imagine the factor of the greenhouse gas, because if you think about, well, if you know that the way that we measure carbon dioxide is not in percentage so much, but parts per million. So about 100 years ago, we were at about 300 parts per million. Now we're at about 420 parts per million. And you could just imagine that, even though it's only 100 parts per million, how much of an effect it is having on climate change. So it is a greenhouse gas, and it's a very effective greenhouse gas. So if the amount of carbon dioxide increases, the rate of photosynthesis will rise rapidly. However, it will be dependent on other environmental factors. Since a plant can only convert carbon into sugars at a set rate, the rate of photosynthesis will eventually level off. I think I might be going too fast. And then it will become constant unless we get more light or more water, right? So, and there's another factor that will increase. Then, the rate of photosynthesis will increase, but then remain back constant. Right. So those are the notes for our remediation, and we shall see you on Tuesday.